Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. Of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website, and remind our internet viewers that they can submit questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, we always appreciate that last check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin the program. And of course, we will post the program on Heritage's homepage following today's presentations for your future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council for 4 years. He also previously served as a Senior Country Director for the Council, representing American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. He has also served as a Senior Professional Republican Staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as well was a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, foreign policy issues. Currently, he serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thanks, John. Well, thank you all for coming out. As you know, the whole purpose of the gathering today is to talk about President Obama's upcoming trip. That is a trip in end of April to Japan, Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines. I think it's fair to say that this is not sort of a bureaucratic State Department type briefing. We're going to be talking so much about what he will do and what, all the various details of the partnership for X and Y that he's going to sign in KL and that sort of thing. I think fair to say we're going to talk about what he ought to be doing while he's there. And we've got a couple really good people to lead us through that. First of all, Randy Shriver, who's President and CEO of Project 2049. He comes here and speaks probably 2 or 3 times a year, I suppose. But we are a frequent collaborator with Project 2049 and glad to be so. It's a great think tank based right over the Potomac River. Randy was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Bush administration, and he was the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State, also in the Bush administration. Bruce Klingner has been with Heritage about the same time I have, so 7 years, right? 7 years. Before that, he was 20 years in the intelligence community, mostly with the CIA, where he was Korea chief of the Korea branch there, and a number of other Korea-related responsibilities. So Bruce has been looking at Korea a really long time. He's also been looking at Japan. He does all of our Japan work. He does Korea and Japan for us. So what I'm going to do is let Randy lead us off. Bruce will follow, and then I'm going to come back from over there and talk about the trip to Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Here? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Walter, and thank you to Heritage. It's great to be back 2 or 3 times a year. Seems not even enough. I'd love to come back more. Anytime I'm welcome. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this topic. I think this is a very important trip coming up. I know there are certain things we say in government and in policy, very important trip and window of opportunity and so forth, and sometimes these phrases sort of lack meaning because they're overused, but I do think this is a very important time for the president to be visiting the region for a lot of reasons, some of which I'll get into related specifically to Japan, and a particular window of opportunity for progress in our bilateral relationship with Tokyo. So the first point, and I hope it doesn't sound unserious or glib, I think the first point is the president needs to make this trip. He's canceled previous trips. So you could argue for understandable and good reasons. But for an administration that rhetorically continues to commit itself to the rebalance or the pivot or placing Asia in a place of priority, the president needs to spend personal time and give personal attention to these important relationships. So he needs to make this trip despite what may come up between now and then, and certainly hope he does. I mentioned it's a window of opportunity in Japan, and again, I hope I'm not falling guilty of what I just accused others of, sort of overusing this phrase, but I think with Tokyo, this is true, and I think it's true for a number of reasons. Number one, I think we're in a period of really unusual political stability in Japan. We all know how many prime ministers and how many years Japan has had recently. But with the recent elections and the success of the LDP, we now know we'll have a Prime Minister Abe, barring something really unusual and unforeseen. Prime Minister Abe in power for about 3 years with control of both houses of the Diet, the lower and upper houses, as well as his ability to date to sustain popular support, also something very unusual of recent Japanese prime ministers, to include Prime Minister Abe 1.0, who was elected, you'll recall, after Koizumi with very high levels of support, but almost immediately plunged. And this 2.0 version, he's done quite well in maintaining popular support despite having to take some difficult moves related to economic reform. So Japanese political stability and some, I would argue, mandate to do some difficult things, to include things in the area of security and things related to the alliance. So that's number one. Number two, I think we still have at least the rhetorical commitment of the administration to make Asia a priority and to sustain Japan as the cornerstone, is the catchphrase we use, but really the foundation for our Asia rebalance strategy. And that's important. You could critique this and say perhaps it's more rhetoric than reality. There's questions about resources, particularly related to defense. There's a lot of questions about the time and attention of the second-term cabinet. Do they care more about the Middle East? Are they being forced to turn attention away given the crisis du jour, which could be Ukraine, Syria, missing airplane, whatever it may be? Are they able to keep their focus on really implementing the pivot and adding specificity to the rhetorical commitments? But I think in and of itself, sustaining the rhetorical commitment and saying Asia is important, enjoys a place of priority from the president's perspective, contributes to this window of opportunity. And I think number three, anytime you want to do things in the context of the alliance, it always helps to have help from China, from North Korea, and we're getting both right now, which is also a little bit unusual. So China's playing the part with moves like the ADIZ and more assertive behavior in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, another incident I just read about in the media related to the Philippines. North Korea is also playing to form. I know Bruce will probably talk a little bit more about that. And it's not that you wish for these things or hope for these things, but certainly it's a reminder and it underscores the need for a strong alliance when China's behaving the way it's behaving and North Korea is behaving the way it's behaving. So I think all these things do create a window of opportunity, but it's just that. For the window of opportunity to be leveraged and seized, you have to actually extract the possible agenda items and put energy into it for that window of opportunity to be taken advantage of. And so I think thinking about what is possible for the president and what would be helpful and perhaps even necessary is the second part of what I wanted to address today. And I think there are a few things that are obvious and maybe a couple less so, and then a couple landmines I'll mention. I think the obvious one, the number one thing, I think we need to see movement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the U.S.-Japan bilateral piece of that. And this is getting harder almost by the day. It's, we're in a situation where we know where we need to go, but we're both looking at each other saying who's going to move first. And it's basically has to be the United States. And for our trade officials to be able to have credibility, there needs to be some level of confidence that we can get TPA, or that we have a game plan, or we have some idea of how we're going to move forward with TPP in the near term, in the absence of TPA in the near term, and perhaps even beyond the midterm elections. How they seem to float this idea that they don't need TPA. I think that's probably not true, but if they're somehow persuaded that that's the case, they need to make that case more compelling to our friends in Tokyo. this is a tough environment. We're asking Japan to do difficult things, particularly related to agriculture, but they're looking at us and saying, can you get this deal through your own Congress? So this is a time for real presidential leadership. And he needs to be able to go, I think, first and foremost in private, but also publicly and say, here's how I'm going to bring my caucus along. Here's how we're going to get this done. And here's the things I'm willing to do and the risks I'm willing to bear to move this forward. Without the U.S.-Japan piece, the whole thing really does threaten to unravel as we increasingly hear others are really looking at this one piece before they're willing to put their neck on the lines and take some risk with respect to trade liberalization. I think the second opportunity relates to the ongoing discussion about the military-to-military relationship and how we're going to implement defense guidelines, the U.S.-Japan joint defense guidelines, and what that might mean for a subsequent discussion about roles and missions. Now, I realize this gets somewhat into the weeds for a presidential level visit, but I think for the president to be able to endorse a process that's underway, we've finished a QDR, we're in another budget cycle, we're talking about sort of the possibility of a post-sequestration environment where we have higher level confidence in what our resources will be in out years. A Japan defense guidelines process that's concluded. So we're now at a pretty important point. And so for the president to endorse this process, to be able to say that we have confidence in Japan as it makes particular decisions related to its constitution, related to collective self-defense, and related to more realistic contingency planning between our militaries. That's the kind of thing that it's appropriate for the president to weigh in on and really give the respective bureaucracies the top cover and the support they need to do the more detailed work in this area. But I think it's quite timely because we know Japan is considering steps related to its constitution, a reinterpretation possibly of Article 9. But we know all these other things are underway as well, post-QDR, post-defense guidelines, looking at a joint process. I think there's also an opportunity to have an interesting discussion about energy issues. I think the U.S. and Japan need to think of themselves and need to think of the alliance not just in military and security terms, but really as an energy partnership. And we're still dealing, and I should say our friends in Japan are still dealing with the very real consequences of the triple disaster of 3/11 and still grappling with their energy needs with a different nuclear profile going forward. We're perhaps a very big part of that solution if we are willing to and able to make LNG available. There are various moving parts to that. It could come by virtue of a TPP agreement and Japan being essentially an FTA partner through the multilateral trade agreement, which could make those exports available to them. But there are other ways to achieve that end in the absence of a bilateral trade agreement or a TPP. And I think we should be more aggressive toward that goal, that we should be resource and energy allies, and we should give Japan the confidence that as it grapples with decisions about its energy profile and its future with respect to nuclear energy, that there's some assurance that they have a reliable source of LNG, because where are they getting it right now? Well, Russia, some other countries, but post Fukushima, Russia was a large source and possibly a growing source, and we know that there's new uncertainties related to that. So looking at the energy piece. And then I think another opportunity, lastly, is to continue to pull on this thread of Japan, U.S.-Japan alliance going global, thinking beyond regional challenges. And here I think the challenges related to Ukraine are really important. Important for a number of reasons. We care about what happens there, but we also need partners in the international community with influence to help us achieve the goals that we have in mind. And we know where we're not getting help. We're not getting help from our friends in Beijing. There was some optimism initially. Hey, China hates when people meddle in the internal affairs of others. Won't they be alongside us and a good partner as we approach this challenge. But it turns out that they also, have a strategic partnership with Russia. They also don't particularly like when popular protests drive out authoritarian leaders. They don't particularly like referendums, but so it's a complicated mix of issues for China. But I think they've shown their hand in the recent UN vote and their decision to abstain. Japan, despite the growing reliance on Russia for energy, has stood alongside us, and I think this is an important point to underscore, but also a way to demonstrate that the alliance will be relevant not just on U.S.-Japan security issues narrowly, but more broadly on regional and global security issues. So I think there's an opportunity there. I mentioned I think there's a few landmines. First of all, I think there's a real trap related to what people refer to as the history issues. And let me be very clear about this. There are real concerns and there are real issues associated with Japan's past and how certain leaders in Japan and public figures in Japan talk about the past and talk about history issues. But there's also a level of complexity here, and there's context here that we need to have in mind. For China, this is not necessarily about historical truth and fact, right? This is about really the future as much as it is about the past and their interest in constraining Japan and creating tension in the U.S.-Japan alliance, and they're using history to those ends, as well as for domestic purposes. This is, after all, not a country that is a real steward of historical truth and accuracy. If you walk through their museums, they're, I would say, every bit as offensive and inaccurate as the museum that's attached to Yasukuni Shrine. But there are some real issues here, and I think what the president needs to do is do what good allies and good friends do, which is to have a tough conversation in private. I wouldn't repeat what Secretary Hagel and Secretary Kerry did by visiting an alternate shrine and being a little, in my view, too clever by half, saying, here's the right way to honor the war dead. Well, no, the Japanese are perfectly capable of figuring out how to honor their war dead. What they need to understand from us, from a high level to include the president and privately, is that they shouldn't do China's diplomacy for them, that we're not a disinterested party here. We bear some of the consequences of diplomatic missteps, and that a thoughtful and careful handling of these issues is in our interest, particularly with the Japan-ROK piece as opposed to the Japan-China piece. So here I think there's an opportunity with the history issues as well. I put this in sort of the landmine category for President Obama, but I think Prime Minister Abe's comment on Monday related to comfort women was a very appropriate and good statement. A good first step for somebody who's maybe struggled with these issues, but acknowledging that the Kono statements were appropriate, will not be revised, and then expressing personal sympathy for the suffering of these women, I think was the exact right thing for Prime Minister Abe to do. So there's a chance for President Obama to acknowledge that step, but on the broader issue, I think dealing with this in private is more appropriate than some public scolding of our ally. I think there's also a bit of a landmine in how we talk about China. I think a lot of friends, very much to include Tokyo, are concerned with what we have in mind when we have now embraced this so-called new era of great power relations, or new model for great power relations. Originally, when President Obama met with Xi Jinping in Sunnylands, he gave a very good answer to the question, what do you think about a new era of great power relations? He said, well, it's fine, but we're not a country of bumper stickers or slogans. We're going to judge the relationship based on the quality of cooperation and the outcomes we get when we try to partner with China on regional and global issues. Well, we've sort of morphed along the way until we get to Vice President Biden's visit to China, where he fully embraced this concept of a new model for great power relations without a lot of definition, other than we know the Chinese have something in mind related to core interests. So I think that's raised a lot of questions in the region, and Tokyo very much included. So I think the president needs to have some very good explanation for why we're embracing this concept, what it really means in practice, and what that means for our allies. What place of priority are we still willing to give our allies in this sort of framework that we seem to be embracing? And then finally, I think one of the things I've been surprised about, and I would be interested in the experience of my colleagues here, is how much you hear in Asia about the Syria red line, how much you hear in Asia about overall U.S. credibility. So I think as we, and as President Obama has these discussions in Japan and makes particular asks of the Japanese, whether that relates to Ukraine, whether it relates to Iran, whether it relates to North Korea, that he's fully aware, situational awareness about a credibility problem. And we don't want to contribute to that further. If we're making asks and we're making pledges and commitments, we better be ready to stand by them, because, again, I've just been surprised how much you hear about the Syria red line in Asia and in Japan. And really, I think the need as we go forward and address some really important challenges to understand that credibility is being stressed and challenged, and things need to be done to repair that. So let's not make that worse. Hopefully we can make it better, and the president will have a successful trip. So thanks.
Well, thanks. I'll cover the South Korean leg of the president's trip. And I mean, just to start with the obvious, is it's entirely appropriate for him to go to Korea as well as Japan. That really is, I think, a no-brainer, in that kind of any time any president goes to Korea, he should go to Japan and vice versa, particularly now given the relationship between Tokyo and Seoul. So it was entirely the right decision for the president to go, and almost to the point where they have to make sure he spends as many microseconds in Tokyo and Korea just to make sure no one gets the wrong idea. Because had he not gone, there would have been widespread misperception in Korea that would have affirmed these mischaracterizations that are going on now, of that the U.S. is choosing Japan over Korea, that the U.S. is encouraging a resurgence of 1930s Japanese militarism because of our defense cuts, et cetera. A lot of really inane perceptions, to be quite frank. So as he prepares for his trip, I think first it's a good proper to assess what the status of the alliance with South Korea and the overall relationship is. And to give the answer first is it's really good. It is very, very strong right now, with the exception of one issue, which I'll get to at the end. But under both Presidents Bush and Obama, the relationship with South Korea is, people have said, perhaps the best it's ever been. And really that came about with the election of Lee Myung-bak. So after very strained relations during the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun administrations, the election of MB brought about a major change and a major improvement in the relations between Washington and Seoul. So it's, and that good relationship is important because it allows us to accomplish bilateral issues even when we have disagreements, and it also allows the focus to be outside of the relationship rather than focusing internally. Like, for example, under the DPJ in Japan, we spent an inordinate amount of time focusing on the Futenma replacement facility instead of focusing on, the threats and the need for the alliance and that. So I think if we look at assessing the status of the Washington-Seoul relationship, we can look at it in three categories. The first is the threat perception and policy towards North Korea. Basically, it's, do we have a common threat perception? Do we agree on a policy towards North Korea? And the answer is right now, yes. We are shoulder to shoulder. We're on the same sheet of music, whatever analogy you want to use, and there's no daylight between us. We both see North Korea as a threat. It is growing. We are even more concerned under Kim Jong-Un than under Kim Jong-il. Pyongyang continues to make progress on its missiles and its nuclear programs, and it is a continuing threat, and it's not hypothetical given North Korea's attack on the South twice in 2010. So again, it's very good that we have this same relationship, the same threat perception, again, quite different than under the DJ and the No administrations. Also, there's a lot of respect in Washington for President Park, a lot of respect, a lot of trust, so that we see her trust politique policy as a good one. It's principled, it's pragmatic. It's engaging North Korea or attempting to, but based on principles of transparency and conditionality and reciprocity. Now, as President Park has said, it takes two hands to clap, and North Korea has not been any more amenable to President Park than she was to MB or to President Obama or President Bush. But by having this respect and this trust of President Park, the U.S. is not worried if she reaches out to North Korea or reaches out to China, whereas there would have been concern if, say, Moon Jae-in had won the presidential election. The second category for assessing is alliance issues. And just to highlight, during the last couple of years, there have been a lot of positive achievements or positive progress on a number of alliance issues. We achieved Concept Plan 5029, which is scenarios other than a full-scale invasion. And President Noah refused to make progress on that, but it was achieved under Lee Myung-bak. Also, we had more recently the Joint Counter-Provocation Plan was agreed upon. We've had a very successful security consultative meeting. We've made progress towards Strategic Alliance 2015. So those are all very positive things. There are some issues of disagreement. The Special Measures Agreement, particularly the cost sharing, we've reached agreement, but it still has to get approval by the National Assembly, and that's not a sure thing. And also the OPCON transfer issue. But I would see those as areas where we might have disagreements, but they're within the broader context of a good relationship. So that, I really see it as sort of day-to-day diplomatic disagreements. Even amongst friends you have disagreements, but as long as there's not suspicion, there's not conspiracy theories, you can handle these kind of things. And maybe they take a while, but they're not going to be sort of done in a poisonous atmosphere as has been done in the past. And then I'd say the third area of assessing the relationship is other issues. And I'd say there are three. And these maybe not part of the alliance, but of the broader relationship, the friendship. The first is TPP. And that is difficult. I mean, you're talking about money, you're talking about economics, and you're talking about kind of core economic interests and special interests. I see it as less important of an issue with Korea than it is with Japan, because we've just recently had, 2 years ago, the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. So even some in Korea will say, well, why do we need to join TPP? We already have this FTA, this gold standard FTA with the U.S. So again, there are disagreements with Korea on that, but I see it as less important of an issue vis-a-vis Seoul than it is for Washington with Tokyo. The other issue is the 123 agreement, the civilian nuclear reprocessing. Very complicated, very technical. But for Korea, it really boils down to one issue. It's sort of, we don't understand it, but did we get exactly what Japan got? I mean, that's not the right metric to have. And our nuclear expert here at Heritage, Jack Spencer, has come up with a really good plan. I don't understand it. It's a very technical issue. But he's even briefed it to the South Korean negotiator for the negotiations, who thought it was a very good plan. So, it's the kind of thing where you focus on the technical issues rather than the more nationalist, more emotional, did we get what Japan got? And in a way, that brings me to the third issue, which is really kind of the 800-pound skunk at the party. And that's, as Randy alluded to, the historic issues and right now the very strained relations between Seoul and Tokyo. It is really the one issue that is undermining not only U.S. but allied ability to achieve security interests, security objectives that are common to all three of our democracies, and it also risks straining U.S. relations with both of our critically important allies, Tokyo and Seoul. And much like the Futenma issue sucked the air out of the room in U.S.-Japan discussions, the history issue and the sovereignty disputes and the textbook issues, are really sucking the air out of the room when the U.S. wants to talk about current and future issues. It's diverting attention from very real security threats, as well as achieving common objectives on economic or diplomatic issues. So, and quite frankly, the U.S. has become quite frustrated with both of our allies. On the one hand, there's a frustration with sort of long-standing perception that Japan has not done enough, to reconcile its past history and to apologize and show contriteness. That's been exasperated by either Mr. Abe's comments or perceptions or predictions of what Mr. Abe would do, most of which he hasn't fulfilled. Some were even predicting there'd be a war between Japan and China within 6 months of his assuming office, which obviously hasn't happened. So I think the Yasukuni visit was a very serious foreign policy mistake, but I think quite surprisingly, his comments on the floor of the Diet this weekend, I was surprised by. It had seemed that we were on the road to perdition without an off-ramp, and I think Mr. Abe has shown us a way of maybe beginning a reconciliation process. I thought it was a very bold gesture, certainly one that I think many of us would not have thought, given the hints of what was going to happen. And I think it's a small but still a monumental step forward. And there has to be a lot of follow-up. He missed opportunities during his speech at the UN in New York, during the Davos speech. Those would have been even better for him, perhaps, because they're more public, for him to have made such a gesture. But now that he's done this gesture, he needs to affirm it repeatedly, more publicly, to the point where it becomes expected. Oh, yes, we know Mr. Abe will once again affirm the statements, and he needs to go beyond them. But also in return, Seoul needs to make reciprocal action. And that would be agreeing to a summit meeting with Japan. The easiest would be a trilateral summit meeting on the fringes of the upcoming nuclear summit. Yes, it's only a few short days away, but it's something that needs to happen. And so before, Seoul was saying, we will not agree to a summit meeting until Mr. Abe affirms the Kono and Murayama statements. Well, he's done that. And as Randy said, he made, I thought, a heartfelt comment about, the suffering of the comfort women. So in a way, he's fulfilled the prerequisite. But now, as Japan often accuses South Korea of doing, Seoul seems to be moving the goalposts. And that now it's again calling for concrete steps to show sincerity. Seoul needs to identify what it's looking for other than just sort of this amorphous sincerity. So I think one of the things is the U.S. has tried to avoid a mediator role up until now because we don't want to get in between a fight between two critical friends and two critical allies. But I think, as Randy was saying, is we are involved. And so I think the best role is out of the limelight, private, very frank discussions. And I think actually Mr. Abe's comments are a reflection of some very stern messages coming from Washington to Tokyo, both current officials as well as former senior U.S. government officials. I know South Korea has complained that we haven't expressed, public anger, other than disappointment with Mr. Abe, but there have been, as I said, very, very frank, very stern private messages. And I think the Abe gesture over the weekend is a reflection of the U.S. involvement. So as we move forward, sort of if we can get back on track to sort of what are the things that Mr. Abe or Mr. Obama should be doing on the trip if we weren't diverted by the strained relations between our two friends, is we need to first, obviously North Korea. It's a threat. It's growing. And it's obvious that China is not going to be helpful. I think its refusal to accept even the validity of the UN Commission of Inquiry, which detailed the crimes against humanity that North Korea conducts against its people. Beijing's refusal to even accept that, let alone allow follow-on action, really just affirms that it is not going to be helpful. It has been an impediment at the UN Security Council. It refused to allow any appropriate action after the 2 acts of war by North Korea against the South in 2010. The list goes on. It turns a blind eye to North Korean proliferation. It refuses to fully implement the sanctions, et cetera. So the allies need to take additional steps, and I recently published a research paper identifying a number of things that the U.S. can do unilaterally, targeted financial measures, and we should discuss those with our allies in order to get them to mirror our actions on that. Also, we need to talk with South Korea about its ballistic missile defense program. Right now, its refusal to implement a medium range system, its refusal to integrate the KAMD into the broader allied system, it dooms South Korean citizens to a less effective defense against North Korea's missile and nuclear threat. Also, the three allies need to discuss the increasingly assertive Chinese behavior. I think the U.S. needs to be more firm in its support of Japan over the Senkakus. And also, during the bilateral meeting in Seoul, we need to make progress on those outstanding bilateral issues. And also, the President is actually going to have to address growing allied concerns about our capability and our commitment to the defense of both Japan and South Korea. That's going to be more difficult given the massive cuts to our defense budget. There's a lot of questions about the Asia pivot, which really there is no pivot. No U.S. forces pivoted from Europe, Iraq, or Afghanistan into the Pacific. There are no permanent deployment increases or no new permanent deployments into the Pacific. So that makes President Obama's case a little harder to do given our gutting of our defense budget. Also, as Randy mentioned, the Syria issue. I also was surprised when I visited Tokyo and Seoul, and I was there the week it looked like we were going to attack Syria. And both Japanese and Korean officials said, you've got to hit them. And I said, well, there's a lot of question about how logical that is. Will it achieve U.S. objectives? But really, it's sort of regardless of what you think about the utility of the U.S. fulfilling its red line to attack Syria, the allies are very concerned. And they, in both capitals, said, well, would it be equally inconvenient for you to defend us? Would it be equally inconvenient for you to fulfill a red line if North Korea or China crosses? So they are very nervous right now, and that is something that the U.S. I think has to address. So with that, I look forward to your questions, and I turn it back to Walter.
Thank you. Well, I'll be relatively brief here. I'm still digesting the idea of an 800-pound skunk. I think there's a show on TLC called
Sort of
800. Yeah.
mix and mash analogies.
Right. But first of all, I'll say that I'm, probably needless to say, but I'm really glad that President Obama rescheduled the trip. He was supposed to make this trip in October as a Southeast Asia focused trip. It would have been Malaysia, Philippines, which it is this time, Brunei, and Bali. That would have sent a certain signal to Southeast Asia, I think, that it's worth some exclusive attention on a visit across the Pacific. But that didn't happen for various reasons, and no reason to debate whether or not he needed to cancel, et cetera. I'm really glad that he has rescheduled, and personally, I'm also glad that he's going to Japan and Korea on this trip as well. At this point, I think an exclusive trip would not be the thing to do. I think the administration's in a point now where they've spent 5 years building up goodwill in Southeast Asia. But, it's time to get past that. We've got the goodwill, okay? We've got it in spades in Southeast Asia. Now let's do something about it. Let's do something with that leverage that we've built up. I think the president needs to assert some leadership in the region. And I want to address three specific areas where I think he can do that on this trip. One is on trade. I think Randy touched on it briefly, but the TPP is essential to our Asia policy, our commitment to Asia. The entire economic part of the pivot or the rebalance or the commitment, whatever you want to call it, is tied up in the TPP. That said, the agreement is not going to pass on that geopolitical logic. Members on the Hill could care less about geopolitics for the most part. There's some, John McCain and Marco Rubio and a number of others who do care about these sorts of things. But the agreement is going to pass on its economic merits. It's going to pass on the degree to which it can be truly called a free trade agreement. Now, I think one thing the president could do is give a speech in either Malaysia or Philippines about free trade. A speech that he apparently is unable to give in this country fully supportive of free trade. You know, if you look at his State of the Union address, it really talked about free trade in the context of what it can do for environment and labor, not the fact that it gives us everyday low prices and, you know, you know, something he'd focus on more, and I think he did touch on, which is exports. But it's generally a good thing. I hope he can stress that while he's in Philippines and Malaysia, particularly Malaysia, since it is a TPP partner. I think he needs to lead on the matter of trade promotion authority. The whole idea that the president can pass a free trade agreement without TPA it's just political. It's just political. It's an election year. He doesn't want to put his members through a vote on TPA. That's all it's about. It's impossible to pass a trade agreement without TPA. You know, I think in Malaysia in particular, there's weakness on TPP. So there's the problem that we have with Japan, which is a bilateral set of issues we need to work out through their 5 or 6 sacred sectors. But Malaysia's coming under a lot of pressure domestically. We have a record of failure in Malaysia on free trade agreements. We tried during the Bush administration and came to an impasse that we couldn't get past. It's not inconceivable that Malaysia gets tired of waiting and drops out of this, especially, you know, given that they're not sure about the amount of authority the president has to negotiate an agreement. Gets back to the TPA issue a little bit. Second general area I think the president can assert some authority on is on security issues. I think he has an opportunity to give ASEAN some backbone on the South China Sea. We have invested in the process, so we've demonstrated already that we care about ASEAN's processes. We're working through them. The president has attended the ASEAN Leaders Summits. We've got our Secretary of State, Secretary of State Clinton was going there 7 times a year, and Secretary Kerry has even managed to drag himself out of Turkey or Cairo, wherever he happens to find himself in the Middle East, and make it over to the region. So we have demonstrated our commitment to the region and their processes. Now we have to inject them with some substance and some leadership from our side. I think we should encourage Malaysia to support the Philippines on its arbitration case on the 9-dash map. All of ASEAN is pretty much silent. There's one degree or another of silence within ASEAN. Then as an organization, they've been silent on the Philippines arbitration case. I think the Malaysians should come out, fully support the Philippines taking it to arbitration. That is, they don't have to support the details. They have some dispute with the Philippines over it themselves, but endorse the idea that UNCLOS is the right mechanism for resolving this, and the arbitration is the right way to go. I think the president can strongly support the claimant working group that has been put together. You know, just a couple weeks ago, the 4 claimants, ASEAN claimants, met in Manila, separate from ASEAN, to talk about how they could coordinate efforts over the South China Sea. Actually, it was 3. The Bruneians skipped, and will likely skip the next one. But there's another one planned for the end of this month. I think the president can get fully behind that process and give some idea about the parameters of where he thinks the solution should come out and the way it ought to be managed. I think the president can clearly call out China as the problem in the South China Sea. You know, I don't understand why it's so easy for all of us to see what the problem is, but a U.S. government official cannot say it out loud. Okay, it's the Chinese claims in the South China Sea, the extent of them and their extra-legal nature, that is the problem. And I think the president should say that out loud, and he should say it publicly. The third set of issues are political issues, and mostly regarding Malaysia. You know, I think the president, given his affinity for Malaysia, he seems to get on well with Prime Minister Najib. He has family connections. He has an extraordinary amount of goodwill in Malaysia going in, probably one of the places he's most popular in the region. The sense that he understands Islam goes a long way in Malaysia. And the fact that he's making this trip, the first by our president since 1966, alone ought to count for something. But I think given all that, again, in the theme of okay, you've built up this goodwill, now use it, I think he can hold a mirror up to Malaysia and give them an idea of how the rest of the world is seeing them today. The Flight 360, Malaysian Airlines 360, is sort of the perfect example right off the bat. I mean, I don't know that Malaysian friends realize how incompetent they actually look to the rest of the world. You know, I don't know that they realize that people jump to conclusions on terrorism and that sort of thing just because they think they understand what Malaysia is. I think he can point that out to them. I think he can point out the impact that Anwar Ibrahim's travails have on Malaysia's international profile. I mean, I don't care one way or another, personally or politically, about Anwar. I don't think he is the great saint that he's made out to be, the great saint of democracy. But, you know, he is the opposition leader, and this long-running legal case against him is clearly politically motivated. And President Obama can point that out to Najib. Najib certainly heard it before, but he's not heard it from the President of the United States and someone who he counts as a friend, that they're largely seen as going contrary to the rule of law and pursuing politics through the courts. In a similar sense, I think he can use the case pending against the use of Allah by Christian populations in Malaysia. I don't know if you follow this issue very closely, but basically the courts back and forth through a series of cases have determined that Christians are not allowed to use the word Allah, which is the way that Christians through the Middle East have referred to God for 2,000 years, and the way that Malaysians have referred to it since there was a Malaysia, and people reading Malay language Bibles. Again, I think the government has been deeply involved in this case. It's not just a matter of the court, so it's not appropriate to say it's sort of like the Anwar case in a way. It's not appropriate to say, well, this is up to the courts and we can't interfere with the courts. In fact, the government is the one who raised the problem in the first place in 2007. And then when the courts decided that actually the Christian Catholic newspaper, the Herald, around which all of this revolves, was allowed to use the word, the government appealed and put a stay on the order allowing them to use it. Again, I think what the president can do here is not so much tell them to reverse it, but stand up for a Christian minority in Malaysia and show the Malaysians, tell Prime Minister Najib what he looks like. I mean, why do people that don't know Malaysia and only know it through some of these cases and through its Islamic identity, why do they think that this current missing flight, Malaysia 370, could be an act of terrorism? Why does that jump to people's mind? Why do commentators on CNN who know nothing at all about Malaysia, why does that even enter in their mind? Would they think the same about Singapore? No, they think about Malaysia because of these sorts of things. So I think it'd be a good, very constructive thing for the president to do privately with Prime Minister Najib. Let me leave it there, and we'll open it to questions. Right here. Down in front. We got a microphone.
Thank you very much for great discussion. My name is Shinichi Sobe with CSIS. My question is regarding TPP issues. Is there other gridlock other than Japanese agriculture in negotiations? Because situation these days, like the Japanese agricultural problem is the only gridlock toward a whole conclusion. But I think there's other many kind of difficult issues like state-owned enterprise, intellectual property, Vietnam, textile, dairy products. So any comments appreciated. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I can start there. I don't know if you all want to chime in, but that's a good point, actually. I mean, if it's a point disguised as a question, that's a really good way to do it. There are a lot of issues. I mean, as far as we know, there's 6 or 7 big issues that are open, maybe more. I mean, it's hard to tell because all the negotiations are behind closed doors. But you know, there's state-owned enterprise issues. There are all the labor environment matters that we're raising. There's rules of origin. You know, I could go through other market access issues on our side, like sugar and whatever. So there's a whole lot of issues. I think maybe the importance of Japan is that it's Japan's entry that gives this the real economic heft that makes it so central to our policy toward Asia, if you want to call it rebalance. And so finding a way to get Japan in requires us to negotiate some of these ag issues and find a way to bring them into the process. I think that's why so much attention is focused on it. It matters less, you know, if it matters, but it matters less if Australia gets access to sugar. You know, it matters much more given the size of Japan and centrality to production chains and that sort of thing.
I agree with that.
Thank you. John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. I have a question for Randy and for other panelists, as you please. Do you see any potential impact on the president's visit, particularly in security fields, by the developing situation in Ukraine and in Crimea? You were talking about a new era of great power relationship. Probably we are seeing the dawn of a new era of great power relationship across the Atlantic as well now. Do you foresee any real possibility of strategic realignment in the world in which the president may, you know, give a second thought to what he may say or may not say in Japan and Korea? Thank you so much.
Well, I think it's a good question. From what I can say now, I don't see realignment as much as I see reinforcement of existing alliances, partnerships, and existing rivalries. I mean, I think this was an opportunity for China to say, this is what we have in mind by new era of great power relations. We'll deal with a very difficult and pressing regional security issue by partnering with you in a different way than we might have in the past, but instead we saw the same old playbook, abstaining in the UN on sanctions. And what I think it says for our allies is, you know, another opportunity to make the alliance relevant for Korea, make it relevant beyond sort of just myopic peninsula issues for Japan, you know, ways to make the alliance relevant on global issues. And look, I think it's, you know, we've gotten into the habit of asking Japan to do pretty tough things at difficult times. Despite energy challenges, we asked them to pull back on imports from Iran at a very tough time, and they did it. Now we're potentially asking them to take a hit in their relationship with Russia. You know, post Fukushima, they turned to a number of countries, but Russia very much included in that group of countries for their energy needs as they eliminated nuclear power from their energy profile. And I have every confidence they're going to do it. But I also think they should get credit for it, and we should understand the value of this alliance beyond just a narrow prism of regional issues, that this is an alliance that stands up on the most important global issues of the day. So I don't, unless I'm missing something, I don't see fundamental realignment. I see reinforcement of existing partnerships and existing competition.
Thank you for doing this. Jun Kaminishikara with Kyodo News of Japan. I have two questions, if I may. One is about the possible trilateral summit meeting of President Obama, Prime Minister Abe, and President Park in Hague. How significant it would be for President Obama to have this meeting before his trip to the region? And the second question is that the exact date of his trip hasn't been announced yet. So do you think there's anything particular preventing the earlier announcement? Thank you.
I'll take it. Yeah, I think on the trilateral, I think it would be very significant because in a way it could help remove an issue from the agenda during the president's trip, which obviously will come after that. Right now, it seems the focus is on the strained relations between Japan and Korea. And so if nothing happens, the majority of the focus in both his stops in Japan and South Korea, I think, would have been on what did he say publicly or privately to each leader, what assurances or lack thereof did he give, which country is he slanting towards. That would all be, I think, the focus, the storm on top of the surface of the water, whereas the reality with most of the work would have been below the water of, focusing on the agenda. So if we could have a trilateral summit that appears to go well, obviously it's not going to resolve all the issues, but if it could be seen as the beginning of a process, then, as we're working those issues, we could then be also in another sort of compartment working on either common alliance issues or addressing security threats. So I think it's very important to work towards having that trilateral summit. Obviously, usually summits require extensive preparation and all that, but we want to go beyond just a gesture of a handshake. But if we can have the three leaders sit down, and they can come out, and as long as none of them criticizes the other, but they can say, yes, we addressed issues in a frank and forthright manner, much needs to be done, et cetera, et cetera. But at least that way we can start to move towards addressing the other issues of today and tomorrow.
Hi, Robert Raffel, the Voice of America. Given the impending U.S. military cuts, how do you anticipate President Obama reassuring U.S. partners in the region about the U.S. ability to handle its commitments to its partners with the Asia pivot, et cetera?
Can I start with that one? Just because I wanted to be very specific in that I think one thing he could do that's concrete is come back with an agreement for new rotations through the Philippines. We've been negotiating with them on the words of this agreement since August, but been talking about an agreement for about more than 2 years, really. So I think if he can either use this trip as a sort of action forcing event, or if he can get there and put the final touches on it, at least give it political blessing to bring home an agreement to allow for increased rotations through the Philippines, I think that would be a very, very positive, concrete thing he can do, as opposed to one more speech on the back of a destroyer or some such thing.
I would just say I'm confident President Obama will give bold rhetoric reassuring our allies that we can still run as fast and jump as high. But whether they believe that will be the other issue. I mean, we've seen, bold rhetoric about the Asia pivot. But if you peek behind the curtain, you realize that there's much more rhetoric than there is reality. Even before the sequestration mandated defense cuts, the administration cut $480 billion from the defense budget. And then when you layer on sequestration, you now have, even though we are not reducing forces from the Pacific, there's really no new things going into it. And even though those forces are fenced, when you talk to the military officers, you hear things like, 1 in 3 U.S. Air Force planes worldwide are grounded because of a lack of funding. Several ships, including at least 2 in the Pacific, can't leave port for training or planned deployments because of a lack of funding. Marines and others will say they can't train as much, so therefore their readiness levels have deteriorated. So even in the Pacific, where we're not reducing, there has been a deterioration of our capabilities, because of the lack of funding. So I think it's an uphill battle. I'm sure the president will say everything is fine, but our allies, like our opponents, can read a budget balance sheet just as easily as the rest of us in Washington can.
I just add, I agree completely. I think it's extremely difficult for this reason. He can say whatever he wants to say, but they can also follow our debate here and see how hard people are fighting against sequestration, if they are, see what kind of budgets they're willing to put on the table and fight for. So I think actually here the risk is to oversell and overstate commitments, because you don't, as I said, I think one of the challenges is a credibility gap. One way, you mentioned how he could do it in the Philippines. One way in Japan, I think, is to talk specifically about contingencies. He's going to be asked about the East China Sea, reaffirming a commitment, but also backing that up with a discussion about how the alliance and the military aspects of the alliance are doing real things to prepare for that. And that's why I think, it's a fine line between, sending the president into the weeds in areas that you really don't want leaders to go, but also saying the right things and reassuring. And I think in this case he needs to get in a little bit into the weeds on where we go post Japan defense guidelines and what we're going to do on roles and missions, to talk about the real contingencies we face. And I think that would be some reassurance that, hey, the president understands this. He understands in a resource-constrained environment we have real threats, real possible contingencies, and he's actually thinking about how to deal with it, and he's empowering his defense establishment to do real things to prepare for it.
Grace.
Thank you. Leah from the Mandarin Service VOA. I actually have two questions. Recently, US and Japan held its inaugural meeting to review the defense cooperation guidelines in Hawaii. So we understand the Japanese side is very concerned about the green zone conflict, particularly with regard to the Senkaku dispute with China. So I'm just wondering if the panelists have any information about that. I know that the United States wanted to talk about broader issues rather than those specific things the Japanese wanted to talk about. The second question is that just recently we learned that the Chinese President Xi Jinping has assumed another new role as the head of the leading group on the military reform. I'm just curious to know your take on that. Thank you.
Well, I guess I wouldn't focus so much on the negative. I'd focus more on the positive, that they're having these discussions, that this is the first review of the joint defense guidelines in over a decade. And if they're having that conversation, no, we want it to be more about East China Sea Senkaku as a specific contingency. No, we want it to be more about broader issues. That's a good discussion to have, because we need to close the gap on those things. The reality is, a productive discussion about joint defense guidelines is going to lead to a discussion about roles and missions, and then acquisition. It's going to sort of open up a whole range of things we need to talk about. But as long as the sort of end goal is in sight and it's a shared goal and a shared vision, I'm comfortable with these initial talks having some different perspectives. That's fine. So I'd rather focus on the positives there. Xi Jinping assuming the leading group for military reform, he sure seems to be accumulating a lot of titles and positions and power, and he's, all the important issues he's willing to put on his shoulders. I think the good news from a Chinese perspective is if anybody can do it, he can. I think the bad news is he's creating unbelievably high expectations, and he's bound to fail and fall short. I think what it probably does is sends a signal to the military to stay in line. There are ongoing questions about civil-military relations and the degree to which he controls, and those questions on operational issues are almost impossible to answer with any great specificity. But if he says, hey, I'm also in charge over here on military reform, and everyone knows, well, that could mean corruption, that could mean acquisition, that could mean any number of things. That's another stick he holds over them, so it's another way of sort of exerting civilian control over the military.
Thanks. Nicholas Hamasevich from the Korea Economic Institute of America. This question is mainly for Bruce. Bruce, do you think President Obama will be asking President Park anything on the Ukraine-Russia situation, given that one of her ideas and options for inter-Korea relations was to try and do that joint investment with Russia into North Korea?
Good question. It's a stumper.
You stumped Bruce?
Yeah.
Oh, come
Well,
on.
it's sort of outside of Korea, but yeah. I think
never seen
the initiative with Russia toward North Korea, I don't think was going very far, very fast anyway, and so I think she would be disturbed by Russia's action, taking over the Crimea. So I think rather than trying to move forward on a North Korean issue with Russia, I think the focus will be more showing allied solidarity on, sort of standing up to Russia, taking Crimea. So I think there will likely be a lot of discussion, although it would be ahead of time as well, as on what should be the world's reaction to Russia's action. So discussing sanctions, discussing economic pulling back from engagement with Russia. So I think that would be the primary focus, kind of the bigger issue rather than a more specific kind of inter-Korean issue.
Hi, Sam Munn of Project 2049 Institute, and I think this question would be for Bruce. So you had mentioned that the Koreans are reluctant. The Koreans have reaffirmed their stance that they wouldn't join the trilateral ballistic missile defense mechanism between Korea, Japan, and the United States, and they often state that it's because they don't want to antagonize China. But yet North Korea keeps shooting ballistic missiles and test firing missiles into the Sea of Japan and the Sea. So is it really because of China, or I mean, North Korea will continue these provocations, but what do you see as really the obstacle to getting this done? Because really the existential threat to Korea is North Korea, to South Korea is North Korea, and to say that they don't want to risk their relationship with China is kind of confusing to me. So
Right. No, I think there's a lot of potential reasons why South Korea doesn't want to join, and I think we debate which one or ones are the reason. Some Koreans will say, well, why worry about missiles when we have to worry about artillery? And the revealing of yet another new multiple rocket launcher, the 300 mil that we saw recently, which can range all the way down to Pyeongtaek, obviously shows the danger of North Korean artillery. But to ignore the North Korean missile threat just because there's another artillery threat, I think isn't logical, because North Korea has 800 missiles that can hit all of South Korea. They can hit with persistent or non-persistent chemical weapons, biological weapons. I think increasingly it's obvious that North Korea has a nuclear warhead that can fit atop the Nodong, just like Pakistan has the nuclear warhead on the Gari, which was originally built in North Korea. So I think South Korea can't ignore the missile threat. Others will say it's cost. Others will say it's not wanting to alienate China. And I don't think not alienating China should be South Korea's primary political objective. If they talk about, it could create an arms race, well, North Korea is already the one who's been building all the ballistic missiles to threaten the South. China certainly hasn't done anything to stop that threat. It's been an impediment. So, and it's a ballistic missile defense system, so it shouldn't aggravate China, because it doesn't, even a longer THAAD-like missile system, it doesn't threaten China because it's defensive. So I think what South Korea should do is look at what is the best way to defend its people against a very real threat. By having only SM-2s or PAC-2s or PAC-3s, it's like, if you think of the peninsula, it's just a lot of little bubbles of protection, and there are a lot of seams that those missiles could get through. By having a THAAD or something similar, it's like a bigger bubble over all of South Korea, which then better protects the citizenry. So again, I don't know why South Korea has been reluctant. Some even say it's because they don't want to be integrated with Japan, given the strained relations. But I think whatever the reasons that Seoul has been hesitant to join, I think should be overcome by the pledge to defend its citizens the best way possible against a very real security threat.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tong Hui from Chinese Embassy. I don't have a question, but I only have a few comments. Everybody knows that China-U.S. relations is complicated, but I think the essence is about power. the China's original thing is China has a potential to challenge U.S. leadership. As long as China has such potential, I don't think U.S. relations will be simple and smooth. So if you look at, it's not the simple thing that China take off the red jacket and we can be good friends, like a Communist Party step down. China become democratic sometimes, so we can be good friends. Look at Russia. Look at the Soviet Union. Even Soviet Union collapsed and fell apart, and the Russian Communist Party stepped down. Their selection, but still, the NATO expanded to its territory. I think the same scenario between China and the U.S. So I think now President Xi Jinping says the new model relations between the big powers. I think is good. No clash, no confrontation. I think that's a good solution for big powers. But I think as long as China has such potential, I don't think the relation between us will be simple and smooth. Well, that's my personal view. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll respond to that if you don't mind. I agree with a couple things you said. I mean, one is that the relations between the U.S. and China is not destined to be smooth. It's also not simple, and I think the ideological overlay in the competition does make a difference because it affects the way the United States sees it, and then China reacts to the way we react to China. If you look at the 1980s when it was Japan that was supposed to be taking over the world. We're actually, at bottom, we got along with Japan quite well. People protested when they bought Rockefeller Center and the rest of it, but it wasn't really great power rivalry, I wouldn't say. So, I think, with regard to China challenging U.S. leadership, those abstractions just matter so little to me anymore. That is, recognition of American predominance, or recognition of American allies, recognition of U.S. leadership in the region, et cetera. Those are meaningless phrases. So I think China can recognize America's interest in maintaining its position and its predominance and its allies and its leadership and all the rest, and in the meantime take control of all of the features in the South China Sea. But we recognize your leadership, and meanwhile you take each island, each feature one at a time. You take Senkakus, you take all of them, but all the while reassuring the United States that we recognize your leadership. So those things matter very little to me. I think if the relationship is going to proceed, I think we really have to talk about the things that are at stake, the real things, and not a bunch of abstractions. I think because the way the Chinese system works, the way we see it here is everyone comes to town, whether you're officials or whether think tankers, et cetera, with the same set of talking points, basically. And those talking points are generally that the relationship is good. But none of the people that come through here are listening to the feedback. This town is more negative about China than any time I can remember. I mean, my own career doesn't go far enough back to the Korean War and that sort of stuff. But I mean, it used to be heritage would be more negative than most. There are people now that were on our left that are now more negative than we are. So I think the fact that Chinese officials are just repeating their talking points and not listening means that you're not getting a good picture of where Americans are on the relationship, and that's not a good thing either. Not conducive to peace, I would say.
I just would add very quick. Thank you very much for the comment. I appreciate the intervention. On the expression by Xi Jinping of a new era for great power relations, new model for great power relations, I think it's something to take quite seriously, and I think it's something to explore. What I object to is a full embrace and use of the term without having any specificity or definition. It's sort of to be filled in or to be determined later. We have some idea of what China has in mind, because increasingly when I see new model of great power relation, there's always a comma, respect for core interests. You see that in the statement of your foreign minister, you see that elsewhere. Well, we sort of know, although the term core interest seems to be a moving target sometimes. Is South China Sea a core interest? Sometimes yes, sometimes not as clear. East China Sea, Taiwan certainly, Tibet certainly, Xinjiang certainly. So what I object to is sort of this full embrace, and we're going to use it. And now we're sort of subject to accusations of violating the spirit of a new model of great power relations when it was never really clearly defined to begin with. The other thing is, I don't date back to the Korean War either, but I date back 2 decades now, 20 years ago. And when I first came to Washington, we were building toward a constructive strategic partnership. Then we were working on a responsible stakeholder formula. There was the 3 C's: candid, constructive, cooperative. I probably mixed that order up. And so there's a tendency for people who have a little bit of a time horizon to say, here we go again, another bumper sticker, another slogan. From what I've seen since the term was rolled out, is not a lot of there. I mean, the announcement of an ADIZ with no prior consultation on the eve of Vice President Biden's visit is not exactly in the spirit. Well, if it is in the spirit of a new great power relationship, I don't particularly like the formula. So I think it's important that Americans and particularly American officials give it due attention and take it seriously, because it's coming from President Xi himself. That in and of itself means that we need to listen and need to explore it. But I think there's some pitfalls here that I'm not sure we're fully aware of.
We exhausted everyone. Great. Well, thank you all for coming out. Please join me in thanking our panelists and our long associate here in Spring.